kind of awkward. So thank you everyone for coming. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Lora Iannotti, who's the Lauren and Lee Fixel Distinguished Professor in the School of Public Health, and she's the founding director of the E3 Nutrition Lab. Her lab aims to identify nutrition solutions that embrace principles embodied in the 3 E's: equity, environment, and evolution. Dr. Iannotti leads projects in Ecuador, Haiti, and Madagascar, where she collaborates with local partners to test innovative approaches to achieving sustainable, healthy dietary patterns that improve young child growth and brain development. Her research related to animal source foods has informed the global discourse on nutrition equity, climate change, and planetary boundaries. Dr. Iannotti also serves as the director of the Food and Agricultural Research Mission, or FARM, Innovative Research Network, and director of planetary health for the Center for the Environment at WashU. She received her doctorate from the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health and a master's degree in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. And her talk title is Why the 3 E's of the E3 Nutrition Lab Matter for Public Health.
Thank you, Mary, and thank all of you for being here and for your attention so far. Just a quick story. Last night, I called my son, who's currently in grad school, because I wanted some advice. He's seeing a lot of lectures these days, and I wanted some advice on how to keep the audience engaged. And I said, I'm doing my job talk tomorrow. And there was this long pause. He said, I thought you had the job already. Anyway, I do hope you're engaged, and I do want to say just a word about feeling very privileged to have this job in the wake of USAID cuts, in the wake of the government shutdown, the chancellor's email yesterday. I feel very lucky to have such a good job. So with that, I'm going to talk to you today about why the 3 E's matter from the E3 Nutrition Lab for Public Health. Okay. It's not moving. Now it's moving. So I need to use this one, I guess. Okay. Okay. All right, so the E3 Nutrition Lab, we do research on maternal and young child nutrition, testing innovative interdisciplinary solutions that embrace each of these 3 E's of equity, evolution, and the environment. We do community-based field data collection, primary data collection in Ecuador, Haiti, Kenya, and Madagascar, and more recently in St. Louis. And then we aspire to bring that to national and global levels to influence policy. Now, before I move on, I want to recognize the constellation of the E3 Nutrition Lab. First, my colleagues here in the second row, Elizabeth, who manages the lab, Michelle, who manages the Haiti projects, and Gifty, who's being pulled into all kinds of things. And then across the globe, actually, we've got stellar teams led by these incredible superstars to continue the constellation analogy. So Shirley Jean-Louis has been with the lab for 15 years, leading activities in Haiti. In Ecuador, we have Gabi Ventimilla, who led a fantastic Mucuna study you'll be hearing about. Elizabeth Kamau and Andrew Wamakoto in Kenya, who led that team. And then Tabita, who sadly is still stuck in Paris. Her flight has been canceled again, I know, who leads the Madagascar team. Now, the E3 Nutrition Lab has many E's in our identity, as you can see, including Elizabeth, which rises up. But emerging from this word cloud comes the principles that sort of permeate all of the research that we do. And those are equity, evolution, and the environment, which I'm going to be covering today. So in the presentation, I'll go E by E. And within each E, I'll talk about the public health rationale for that E. Next, I'll give you a research case study and some early findings from some of the studies and some findings, final results from others. And then I'll end each section with what's on the horizon and sort of future next steps for the E3 Nutrition Lab, concluding with moving from E's to I's and the impacts of the E3 Nutrition Lab. Okay, so E1 is equity. In public health, we target the most vulnerable populations. Number one, because it makes moral sense to do that. From a social justice point of view, it's the right thing to do. But number two, from a scientific and impact perspective, we know that by targeting the most vulnerable, we can get the biggest response. And that means we're going to ultimately have bigger impacts. World Health Organization defines health equity as achieved when everyone, and I underline everyone, can attain their full potential for health and well-being. So our job in public health is to pare away all those barriers, to put in place enablers so that we can all reach our full potential. Now, with the E3 Nutrition Lab, we focus on global nutrition disparities, and in particular on this problem of stunted growth and development. And stunting is defined as -2 standard deviations, height for age, relative to a global growth curve. It's a form of malnutrition we call it chronic malnutrition, and it's related to increased risk for mortality, infectious disease, diminished brain development, reduced schooling and earnings. And then ultimately it has intergenerational effects so that in the next generation, there's reproductive health and consequences for offspring development. And you can see in the map that there are dramatic disparities in terms of stunting prevalence. The map does not represent the disparities that exist within countries. Okay, so this problem of hidden hunger or specific nutrient deficiencies that might be related to a lack of access to poor quality diets is represented in these two panels. So on the left, you see data from biochemical or nutritional status data. And this shows you that over half of children all over the world, in populations all over the world, are deficient in iron, zinc, or vitamin A. Over 2/3 of women of reproductive age are deficient in iron, zinc, or folate. Now on the right, you see heat map. And this is data representative dietary intake. And again, the disparities are evident because the regions are on the y-axis. And you can see as the color goes from orange to red, a higher proportion of nutrient intake inadequacy and the disparities that exist by region and also by gender. Now, I can remember many years ago, Tim will remember this and others, when we were conceiving of the idea of transdisciplinarity and designing courses, writing our textbook. Do you remember that, Tim? We talked about not only horizontal transdisciplinarity, so across different disciplines, but we talked about vertical, from cells to society, and the importance of understanding the biology of these problems in order to react from a public health perspective. So this especially matters for nutrition, the bioavailability, which is the proportion of the nutrient that is absorbed and metabolized. It depends on the biochemistry of that nutrient, individual factors, and other nutrient interactions. So our lab focuses on accessing and animal source foods for many years because there's poor access in a lot of countries. And this matters in terms of bioavailability because the nutrients, those limiting nutrients found in animal source foods are highly bioavailable compared to plant-based foods. So imagine a young child with small gastric capacity needs an efficient delivery mechanism. Vitamin A is a great example. So the form you see here is retinol. That's what our body absorbs. And you need 12 times the amount of beta carotene found in the tall pile of carrots over there to get to one retinol equivalent. So understanding the biology at the cellular level is very important. About 10 years ago now, we had an important study that showed some important findings. The study was called Le Lune. Luis in the back can help us with the translation. Actually, it's Quechua for egg. And this trial was a longitudinal randomized controlled trial, and it was testing 1 egg per day early in the complementary feeding period on child growth outcomes. We had significant effects on length for age Z-score and 47% reduction in stunting growth. This caught the attention of many people around the world. And you can see the public health impact from this with the entire distribution of children moving to the right. So all of them growing closer to their genetic potential. This is what equity is about. Undergirding that was our findings for plasma choline, which we hypothesized, by the way, and then a huge effect size for docosahexaenoic acid, which is a long-chain fatty acid that's important in brain development. And this ushered in the egg era. More E's. Deborah, if Deborah were here, she would appreciate that. If you Google me, you get a lot of eggs coming up. So with Grande, this also led to funding for from NIH for an R01 intervention to replicate the findings from Ecuador. So Grande Bien, which means grow well in Creole, is targeting urban poor young children in Cape Haitian. We have 3 groups that have been randomized, a control group, an A group, and then Grande Bien, which is parenting a stimulation child development plus an egg intervention. We're aiming for the reproducibility and feasibility of the egg intervention, but we want to see if there's an incremental benefit by adding the parenting intervention and explore different pathways. Now, another cool part about Grande Bien, but also the work in Ecuador, is the use of ultrasound in public health. And this is, again, going back to that cells to society. So how can we look beneath the skin to see what's going on in a non-invasive way? Ultrasound is field friendly, it's portable, it's non-invasive, it's just sound waves. So it's an easy way to see what's happening in terms of bone and brain development. So we are looking at imaging relative to some of those nutrition outcomes to see if there's an association. And what you can see on the left is the ulna and radius. This is the hand and wrist that has been imaged. And this work was actually published in the top journal of radiology with commentary by the editor. So it's pretty exciting work. First time this has been used to look at relative to stunted growth. And then in the right, we have an image of the gangliothalamic ovoid, which is a part of the brain that we are able to see before the fontanelle closes. Everybody know what the fontanelle is? It's the opening before in the skull for a fetus or baby that eventually closes, and that's our window that then closes. We can no longer see to the brain. Okay, so some early baseline findings from Haiti. Gifty presented these findings at ASN, and she showed with the baseline findings that child dietary diversity was associated with an increased odds of attaining gross motor milestones. And this is expected. Nutrition quite often affects motor development. And actually the gangliothalamic ovoid is in part can explain that. The cohort-based analysis, then a former doctoral student of mine, Michael Galvin, who's now in Florida, he looked at some of the data. He leveraged the cohort design of Grande Bien. Haiti, sadly, has experienced many humanitarian and natural crises with the assassination of President Moise, earthquakes, hurricanes, torrential flooding. So where we're working in Cape Haitian is a low-lying area, and we get a lot of flooding from the erosion coming down from the hills, deforestation, but as well because it's close to the ocean. So there's a lot of trauma from that. And what Michael did is he looked at the number of trauma events in relation to maternal depression, finding a relationship. Okay, on the horizon for E1. I'm really excited about some work that we're doing with Kim Seelinger and the International Criminal Court. She's organizing her center to acquire expertise from many of us to help make certain charges. So the E3 Nutrition Lab is working on the starvation charge and looking at that in terms of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war. So excited about that. In Haiti, we're writing grants at the moment, talking to foundations unsuccessfully, about a project to use locally grown ingredients for food aid. And this is important because many times commodities are dumped into countries and they ruin markets, and they don't take advantage of the crops that are grown locally. And then in St. Louis, we have a cool new collaboration that Farm has just featured last week with an engineer, Feng Zhao, and a startup, Vertigreens and Tova, where we're looking to use electroagriculture to turn H2O and carbon dioxide into acetate to feed plants, reducing energy, reducing the need for sunlight, and more importantly, giving access to fresh fruits and vegetables in food deserts. Okay, moving to E2, and I'm going to look at all of my colleagues from the Center for the Environment who came for this presentation. I'm very appreciative of that. And they have inspired much of this work, in fact. So in this moment, from my point of view, it is absolutely imperative that we understand, address, and leverage the relationship between human health and the environment. And this is inclusive of the health consequences of climate change, environmental contaminants, but then on the positive side, nature exposures and the built environment. WHO has estimated that a healthy environment could prevent nearly a quarter of global burden of disease. I bet that number's higher, to be honest. Okay, so humans and human activities have now encroached on 6 of the 9 planetary barriers, and food systems are playing an outsized role in this. Food production alone contributes 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, 70% of freshwater retrievals, and 40% of land use. Food waste. Ugh, everybody's going to finish their lunch today, I'm sure. We waste about 1/3 of all food that's produced from post-harvest losses and service industry in both realms. But that is contributing 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. One boundary that that Farm is paying attention to is the biosphere integrity and the issue of increasing homogenization of food supplies. So on the consumption side, 3 plants only, rice, maize, and wheat, comprise 60% of calories consumed around the world. Just 12 crops and 5 animals comprise 75%. On the production side, thanks to Morvan and her statistics from FAO, 9 plant species account for 66% of global food production. 75% of genetic diversity has been lost. This is highly disturbing. The tandem losses in diet diversity and biodiversity are leading to serious health consequences for both human and environmental health. Okay, so moving to the case study in E2, we visit Kenya and the coastal communities of Kenya, in particular small fisher households. Smallholder food producers around the world produce an estimated 50 to 70% of nutrients. Yet paradoxically, they are the poorest and most malnourished populations in the world. So in this study, we targeted small fisher households where there's a stunting prevalence of 37%, very high. And the marine fisheries are chronically exploited with a 4-fold decrease in catch since the 1980s. We set out to answer the question, can we protect both child health and ecosystem vitality? Now, we were lucky in this study. USAID, Feed the Future Fish Innovation Lab, gave us funding for 1 year of formative research. And this is pretty essential when it comes to designing an intervention, especially a behavior change intervention. So with students, with our dear colleague Carolyn Masorgo, over with us, we conducted formative research and determined some of the behaviors and practices around fish consumption with children. We showed that cost, food preferences are key barriers. Female elders, community health workers are influential. Fish is given to the children, but only in a very watery broth and tiny pieces. Most of what the fishers catch, no surprise, this is true for smallholder producers, they sell. And that's sensible because they can get more calories by selling their fish, buying maize. Okay, so after this 1 year period, we designed the Samaki-Salama integrated intervention, which combined the modified traps you can see on your far right, which have an escape valve and it allows juvenile fish to be released back into the ecosystem, into the environment, with a social behavior change communication strategy that included cooking demonstrations, fisher workshops. The fishers really wanted to be involved in this, as well as counseling at the household level. So multiple layers and levels of targeting messages. Samaki Salama, which means secure fish in Kiswahili, examined the effects of a 12-month integrated intervention on 3 different domains: child nutrition or growth, ecosystem health, including things like fish maturity, species richness, trophic level, and then livelihoods. So the catch biomass and value, income, and take-home catch. We used mixed methods across the disciplines, which was super cool, including child nutrition, you can see in the photo. And then we never thought I would be doing this, but it was a lot of fun to be on the beach, measuring and collecting data. At the landing sites, the length of the fish was collected, trophic level, species richness, and then, of course, the livelihoods, as I mentioned, the economics piece to this. It was a cluster randomized control trial, and I love these quasi-experimental designs. They're intellectually very interesting. So we first matched communities on potential confounding factors like baseline nutritional status, fishing gear type, beach management unit, and then we randomized them into 3 different groups: control, social marketing, and the social marketing plus the modified traps to kind of look for this dose response. Good news. Many of you heard me say this before, we got a win-win-win across all 3 of the dimensions of this study. In the first, with child nutrition, with using difference in difference analyses, we showed that this integrated intervention significantly improved child growth in height for age Z-score, increased diet diversity, and increased fish consumption, what we were aiming for. In terms of sustainable fisheries and livelihoods, we also had some positive results. So we increased fish length. They were more mature in the catch. We decreased trophic level of the catch, which is what you want in terms of consumption. We increased catch per unit effort, another ecological parameter that you want. And then in terms of the economics, we increased revenue, catch value, and hugely significant in panel G, had a huge effect on take-home catch. So the families were convinced to take a little bit of that catch home and give it to the children, and it made a difference. So, standard slide. Long fish and long children. We're very happy. Now, on the horizon for E2, we have some work with the Missouri Botanical Garden, UNFAO, and others on we're continuing this initiative on biodiversity and human diets. So last week with the Center for the Environment and Farm and these other partners, we held the Ozark Expert Convening to generate a statement on biodiversity and human diets. We are now moving into a systematic review. Actually, we've been immersed in that for 2 months, but we will continue on that path. And those findings are set to be reported at the Global Biodiversity Forum in Davos, Switzerland. It's exciting. And then we are currently working on grants for both Madagascar and for Missouri to grow food forests and combine that with social behavior change communication. This is just layers of native edible fruits, mushrooms, nuts, and leafy greens. Okay, final E, evolution. This is the E that is our problem child. We quite often have to explain this, and we have a hard time explaining it. Reviewer 1 last week, I'm still grouchy about this, called it contrived evolution, which is so not true. There's enormous amount of empirical evidence supporting this construct relative to human health. NIH actually asked us to take it out of grants. I mean, I guess that's par for the course with NIH right now, asking to take out all kinds of things, but nonetheless, they asked us to take evolution out. This is how we conceive of this construct. So in biology, the change in heritable characteristics of populations over successive generations. In public health, evolution and its elements of natural selection, population migration, genetic drift, and founder effects have shaped the world in which we practice public health. And the E3 Nutrition Lab is focused on sort of temporal dimension of this and the very long period of time that we evolved on a diet that looks different, very different, and the diets that we consume today. Before I move on, you may have noticed the image in this picture. Look at the source of that image. Why, you ask? Why did Renee Iannotti, who's my sister, by the way, draw this image for me? This is a fact. You can try it now. If you Google human evolution, guess what comes up? Men evolving, but I'll guarantee that women were part of evolution. Okay, so again, the E3 Nutrition Lab is especially interested in a particular hominid species called Homo erectus. And this is because Homo erectus started to look more and more like Homo sapien. And then importantly, Homo erectus had some anatomical differences that some have attributed to diet changes, and in particular animal source foods. Now imagine, this is 2 million years ago. Okay, keep that in your mind. My students, we draw it on the whiteboard all around the room, the time scale for this. So Homo erectus had a greater brain size by 3 times the encephalization quotient. They were taller, they had a larger body mass, longer legs, smaller teeth, smaller colon, and larger intestine, in part because of diet. Not entirely, but in part. Now, this is the cool part. This summer, I actually got to meet Homo erectus. So we visited the natural. This is true. This is true. If you haven't seen the Naturalists Biodiversity Center in Leuven, Netherlands, I highly recommend it. It's a superb center. But Homo erectus happens to be there. She was not as tall as I was, but I think she had a bigger brain. Okay. Now, fast forward to 10,000 years ago. Less than 1% of the time since Homo erectus, with the advent of agriculture. And now keep in mind, agriculture didn't suddenly appear just 10,000 years ago. It took many years for it to emerge on our planet, but it was approximately 10,000 years ago. And there are empirically grounded changes in anthropometry and human health, kind of derived from teeth, derived from bones. And what you see is life expectancy went from 40 to 20. Human height, we got shorter. We became infected more often, living closer together, no longer in the hunter-gatherer groups. And then our brain size, actually, people don't know this, decreased as well. We decided we would study this for children because nobody had really looked at children in evolution and their dietary patterns. So thankfully, a COVID project, because it took an enormous amount of time to wade through archaeology evidence, anthropology evidence, and public health evidence to come to some sort of conclusion about child diets in evolution. What we did is we compared the mentioned frequency of foods and food groups in the gatherer-hunter-fisher diet. And I say gatherer-hunter-fisher, do you suppose why? It's always hunter-gatherer, right? Who are the hunters usually? The gatherer-hunter-fisher diets compared to early agriculture to see if there were any differences in the dietary patterns. We found 95 cultural groups, and animal source foods, in fact, were the most frequently mentioned in the gatherer-hunter-fisher. It was a broad range, importantly, a very broad range of foods in the diets of these individuals compared to largely cereals in the early agriculture, which is not surprising. Okay, now moving to the case study for the third E in evolution, we get to the Mikuna trial. This trial has now come to an end. Mikuna means nourish in Quechua. And it was a randomized controlled trial, individually randomized controlled trial. During pregnancy, we had an intervention of a healthy dietary pattern modeled on this evolutionary diet, but adapted to the Ecuadorian context, plus a social behavior change communication strategy. This is a beautiful, had some lovely photos from Marcoms who came with us to Ecuador, and they flew the drone up. And this is El Quinche. It's the study site, one of the study sites. As I said, the intervention was this dietary pattern. It consisted of eggs, fish, and then a diverse range of native fruits and vegetables, which, silly me, I've been pregnant. I've had 3 kids. I know that there are strong food preferences during pregnancy, and there were some issues around compliance to foods that people hadn't tasted before, nonetheless. The social behavior change, we had messaging around diet diversity and reduction of ultra-processed foods. Workshops to promote nutrition, physical activity, breastfeeding, self-care, self-esteem, and emotions. Here's some nice images of the food. So we delivered the food weekly in a food basket and kept careful track of how much of the food that they consumed. Again, used this mixed methods approach longitudinally so we could get the power of the statistics and difference in difference. Fetal and newborn ultrasound, as I mentioned before, maternal nutrition and morbidities. We collected blood to look at the different nutrient biomarkers, newborn anthropometry, and then we used the Hammersmith neonatal neurological exam. And I want to say a word about that because while I am, from an academic point of view, very interested in the brain biological mechanisms and brain morphology, what we really care about is the functional outcome for that child. So we got to that with this tool. Again, using the ultrasound. In the italics, you see the protocols that were new. So the other protocols were followed based on the 21 weeks, the usual protocols during pregnancy for ultrasound measures. And then we added the corpus callosum, the thalamus, and the gangliothalamic ovoid. Can you guess where that is? It's where we source the foods on the way to the Amazon. Quite beautiful. Okay, so our results, we had about 20% loss to follow-up due to miscarriage, relocation, and time scarcity, but we actually had pretty high adherence to the dietary pattern, which is good. Thankfully, we showed that the intervention had a positive effect on the gangliothalamic ovoid diameter. And this is the basal ganglia plus the thalamus. It's important for motor development, for cognition. It's a part of the sort of deeper brain matter. We also significantly increased the corpus callosum, which is the largest white matter tract in the brain. And that was very exciting and not entirely surprising because nutrition sort of matters for white brain matter if you think about the long chain fatty acids. And then we had this odd effect on the femur. We're still puzzling through that and trying to figure out. Fortunately, the effect disappeared by birth, but the kids in the intervention group had shorter femurs. Not sure if it was delayed ossification, if it was, redirecting nutrients and growth to other systems. We're not sure. Okay, and then in terms of the neonatal neurological exam, Mikuna significantly improved scores on tone items, visual and auditory orientation, and consolability. So that undergirded some of that effect that we found for the brain morphology. On the horizon, we have 2 lovely holistic public health interventions that are ongoing. So in the field right now, we have 105210, and this is a public health school intervention encouraging 10 hours of sleep for the kids, 5 servings of fruits and vegetable, 2 hours of screen time, too much, but that's what they chose. And then 1 hour of physical activity and 0 sugar-sweetened beverages or ultra-processed foods. So nice holistic approach. In St. Louis, we've started a collaboration with the med school, with eLab, and we're doing some secondary data analysis, and they have MRIs. I'm pretty excited about that. I can get to the holy grail of hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that I think is going to be very nutrition responsive. And then designing an app and a counseling intervention that is, again, one of these holistic public health for sleep, safety, nutrition, and stimulation. Finally, we're with Tim, who's in the room. We're starting to explore, hopefully with DI2, the application of AI platforms to the imaging data. This is One of the advantages AI can provide is the efficiency around analyzing this data. And our radiologist, it's excruciating. It takes so long for her to analyze that data. So hopefully this will help. Okay, from E's to I. Now the E3 Nutrition Lab is very intentional about the I's as well and the impact. It's important to start early, involve your decision makers early on. It's important to be strategic, and timing is super important in how you disseminate your findings. So in Haiti, we very intentionally embed our activities in the healthcare system. Haiti we were talking about this yesterday, has been occupied for many years by outsiders, by NGOs. And so from the onset of our work in Haiti, we have ensured that we are within the healthcare system out of respect for the director of nutrition, working closely with. We're working in a teaching hospital, a clinic. And then in the education system, we just learned yesterday that the product that we developed many years ago is now used in school feeding programs. So that's cool. 70 to 80,000 children are being fed. In Kenya, governance is more decentralized. So we work with more regional kind of entities, including the Directorate of Blue Economy, distributing basket traps now, those traps, as well as several local projects that I will go through. And then in Ecuador, we actually changed policy. So the government now recommends introducing eggs earlier in the complementary feeding period. That's exciting. Eggs and poultry production trials have gone on around the world. And Mikuna, not yet. So Luis verified this for me yesterday. We've met with the Vice Minister for Health about integrating some of these foods into the pregnancy food basket, but it hasn't happened yet. So we're hoping. And then public-private sector partnership, we're working with a group called NIDA. In terms of global impact, the E3 Nutrition Lab has been involved in these UN reports, including the WHO guidelines for complementary feeding. And as I mentioned last week, this is the group of expert convening, some of you in the room, on biodiversity and health. And we hope that continues, that initiative continues. Two very cool initiatives at WashU that signal the support of this university for this work. So I want to call out the Center for the Environment and the incredible work that they have done to inspire and to amplify research on the environment at our university around these themes of planetary health, biodiversity, environmental solutions, and environmental justice. So kudos to you guys. And then FARM. So concluding with FARM, newly launched, but good start so far, I think, under the direction of Morven, all of the innovation research networks. So let's hope that this takes us places, especially in terms of the sort of food security side of nutrition. And here we have my long children. You can see the Sears Tower, they're almost as tall. I have experimented on them over the years. In fact, Eli said he didn't get his fish on Sunday to make him smart for the week, so he was regretting. Okay, so thank you very much. Are there questions? Mary has a question. Wait, sorry. Mary did. I was like, where's?
You're right.
You can go wherever. I always have a question. Thank you so much, Laura. That was fascinating. I wondered if you've done any interventions on either male parents or families when you've gone overseas. I've seen some research where that can really change the food environment for women in particular. And since you brought up gender disparities and how we study some of this, I just was curious if you know anything about that.
It's really context dependent, Mary. I mean, we in Smaki Salama in Kenya, the fathers really wanted to be involved. So we intentionally designed these Fisher Watt workshops around child nutrition and involved them. And you saw the effect. I mean, huge take-home effect. Now in Haiti, I was just reading stats this morning. Most of our women are single. Am I right, Michelle? It's like a large proportion are not married. And We actually made efforts to involve, and you can ask Trish Cole is my collaborator on this. So initially we intended to have fathers involved, and it just didn't work. So I think it's context dependent. But yeah, it's a very good point. Sure. Microphone, sorry.
Just talking about Haiti as well, I would actually say some of our loss to follow-up was fathers not wanting their children to participate. So we actually kind of saw that as a negative. But I will say there were a few dads who were in the parenting intervention and they were very enthusiastic. So it just depends. But
it depends.
Yeah, like Laura said, context, but just throw that in there.
Thanks, Michelle.
Laura, thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. A question for you about, the 3 E's. And you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that ultimately you hope to be able to have a beneficial impact on policy. So when you're engaging with policymakers, is it one of 3 E's that they respond to more, or is it sort of that 4th E, economics, that we really haven't spoken to?
I mean, actually, it's interesting, Morgan. We when the E3 Nutrition Lab started, do you remember, Elizabeth? We had economic access. I can't remember what it was, but it was economics, and that's the one that we changed to equity. Which, in my view, it's almost synonymous because of poverty and the being vulnerable groups. I mean, it's one. We've talked about this. It's one of the gaps in my research is having economists on my team. We did for Kenya. But I think it's absolutely crucial for making a policy argument is the cost benefit, cost advantages of these interventions, the trade-offs. So I think it would just be that much more powerful if we had those arguments. And actually, well, Trisha's not here, but we do have Derek on the Grande Bien study. So hopefully some of that can be crafted with his involvement. Derek Brown. Mark.
Yeah, again, thank you for a really excellent presentation. And again, I think when it comes to the 3 E's, the evolutionary one is also the one that I find the most fascinating and also kind of the more challenging to to understand. And I guess as you're looking at kind of humans and their past evolutionary environments, I mean, to what extent, I guess one thing that's hard for me to tease out is, so much of the food that we eat is also been evolved or has been bred to by humans to it change the context of what we eat. And then in the case of animal protein, they're eating the feed rations that they're eating, or it just seems really complicated. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you tease that out. And even I think with a lot of those wild foods, there's probably been, I feel like we always underestimate the impact that humans have had on kind of the environment writ large. And I would just wonder if there's any indications, even in a lot of these wild foods, of human breeding, essentially, or human transformation of those plants.
No, I read a book on this very point, which is that, it's not that we're evolving in isolation, but everything around us is evolving. And so it's a really important point. And I am by no means, an expert in sort of how that happens. We've thought about it in terms of humans, and it's again a timescale question, which is how fast can we respond to our environment genetically or epigenetically? And there's not a whole lot of evidence. Lactase persistence is a good example. They have estimates of that's when you become lactose tolerant in populations that are dairying, for example, and you evolve to be able to absorb milk or lactose. And that's about an estimate of about 2,000 years. But it's hard to say. We can quickly adapt with epigenetics. And I think that's kind of the next horizon in terms of understanding, responding to the environment. But to me, it's very disturbing that it's really been since the Industrial Revolution, last 100 years. I mean, that's a teeny tiny fraction. that we've, all the ultra processed foods have now entered into the diet. Can't be good. Exactly, the microbiome, right. Yeah, we didn't even get into that with the Ozark convening. It's complicated. Patrick?
Thank you, Laura. Really, really cool. So moving forward, and the new capacity for farm and the Center for Environment. My question is, so is there capacity to partner with Monsanto or any of the local ag tech companies that are, I don't know how to characterize.
I'll deflect to Norman.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously.
Well, now never sitting up front again. Yeah, we will be. I mean, we're taking with all of the IRNs and including farm. And I certainly can't speak to the Center for the Environment, so I can pass that back over to Dan. But multi-sectoral engagement is really important. And when you're talking about something like the food environment, not engaging with the private sector, I think is almost going to predefine you to not succeeding, because there is so much influence, both positive, negative, and neutral. And so, yes, I think there's an opportunity, for example, for some of the nutrition expertise to be applied in, refocusing maybe where we're putting emphasis in terms of trait development. So I think there is a lot of opportunity there, but we also have to be mindful of that, both from a communication standpoint, a funding standpoint, perceptions of influence, et cetera. So I think having the plurality of organizations, public, private, civil society involved in the work we do helps us get to better answers and better interventions.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. And trust me, they are in my inbox. They are, honest. So it's we're sorting through it.
Thank you, Laura, for that great talk. In your discussion about impact, you talked a lot about engagement with government, and it was specifically with your work in Kenya. You mentioned that environment was very decentralized, and you had very involved fishermen groups. So I'm curious, has there been any effort or interest in fishermen unions to adopt this program and disseminate that across their membership?
What a great idea. I am not aware of that, but I can pass that on to my colleague. So Andrew was the one who shared some of that information with me before this talk, and I'm sure he would love to, get the suggestion.
This is from online, and it is from none other than Matt Kruder, and it says, "Effing brilliant work and presentation. The study protocols seem to involve considerable measurement among pregnant women and children. Do you find any differences in willingness to complete these protocols between participants from the US versus participants in your global communities?"
Good question. So far, we haven't delved into that deep enough, I think, to answer that question. But I am certainly going to pay attention to it. I will say that in Ecuador, I'm very proud of many of our studies showing very low losses to follow-up. In Haiti, where people say you can't do research, we have like 7% loss to follow-up. It's really impressive. And that's all down to Shirley Jean-Louis Dulions. But in Ecuador, we struggled. So I'm disappointed with the 20% loss to follow-up, and I'm not sure if that compares in St. Louis or in other. Anybody know approximately if you have pregnant women in your experience? In any case, I think there's a whole lot more going on in a pregnant woman's life. For Ecuador, what happened is that many of them wanted to go home to the countryside to give birth. So we lost, that time point to collect data. They're just time scarce. They don't have time. That's a reality for a lot of women and mothers, right? So it's completely understandable, I think, that we had that loss to follow, but it's also disappointing. I will look into this in the St. Louis data. We're not yet there on it.
Yeah, my question is a little bit of a follow-up to the question about connecting with industry. You did mention partnering with Tova. Is it City Greens?
Verdigreens.
Verdigreens, thank you.
Hydroponics verdigreens.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you could, this is a really broad question, but if you could just share a little bit about what it's been like to partner with a small startup in the St. Louis region.
Yeah, again, at the start of this collaboration, but so far it's been fascinating to kind of see what plagues her and what, you know, for her, it's really about the economics and staying afloat. So I think like any social enterprise, she's got to get these grants to, you know, just keep moving forward. But I'm really enjoying it. I think it's, again, it's kind of a new collaboration with engineering and with this startup.
Following on the theme of dissemination and also like policymaker impact, have you had any experience or see any results in terms of working with policymakers outside of the nations that you're working with? And is there an uptake of the lessons learned from these case studies outside of the nations that you worked with? And is there a relationship between the research having happened there being buy-in from the start versus, oh, this was a lesson that our neighbor learned, we might be more skeptical about about adopting that for ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, excellent question. And I think I am not aware, but once we finished our study and people took it and ran, like for example, the eggs in different countries, I didn't really follow what happened in terms of policy impacts. I definitely followed in terms of study results because I was very curious about the replication piece of this. I think for us, what we're paying attention to, and I was thinking of relabeling the policy impact, not so much national, but like it's sort of the international, and that is because it's within nations. But at a global level, what people don't realize if you're not doing the global work with the UN is that there are many countries that pay very close attention to these UN reports and those UN guidelines. Our country could care less. We don't sign on to the Code of Breast Milk Substitutes. We don't sign on to any of the environment, nothing, right? But in many parts of the world, they pay close attention. So from the E3 Nutrition Lab point of view, working on these UN reports and UN guidelines are important for many places in the world. It does trickle down.
All right, we had a follow-up online. Ragini Madhupati was answering your question and Matt's question and said, not from pregnant women, Laura, but working in reproductive health, loss to follow-up is harder to maintain the 80%. So for anyone wondering.
Thank you, Ragini.
Thank you, Laura. Really great talk. You have great results across the countries, and one of the components was your strategic behavior change communications. And we all know that behavior change is so challenging in the public health work that we do. What were the nuggets that you took away from your results that could be applicable and replicable in other countries, even in the US?
Yeah. Great question. And I want to say, I mean, to Morven's point earlier about the food environment, it has to be both. So you have to address not only consumer behavior, but you have to address the food environment where people, where they get their food and how much it costs and all of that. So we do the social behavior change communication, but we also understand that there are limits within the larger environment. I think the key nuggets or key takeaways for us is that number one, it takes time. It takes multiple levels of communication to convey those targeted messages across different, coming from different platforms. So it might be, from the health clinics, it might be from, from schools, it might be different platforms that are delivering those messages. The most effective, I would say, is it's a counseling intervention where it's a dialogue and not, and this we've known for years. I mean, my behavior change people can talk about this, but you have to meet people where they are. I mean, I'm not saying anything new, but it has to be a dialogue. So in that particular household, what are the barriers to her giving that fish? And how can we get around those in dialogue? We used to call it designing by dialogue. And it's pretty important, but it's intensive and it's expensive. So SBCC is not, it's expensive. I'm not naive about that.
Thank you. I love this. It's all so interesting and cool. And I'm wondering, as you are maybe forced by current circumstances to be reorienting somewhat to more US contexts, how you're thinking about like communicating your research to audiences in this environment where nutrition science is not politicized, because I don't think that there's like necessarily polarization in how different people are viewing it, but definitely like dramatized or like prone to conspiracy theories. And like there's a lot of kind of like folks in the do your own research crowd who are not necessarily like taking the best parts or the nuanced parts of your research away from what you are learning. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about or how you're changing how you're talking to communities, policymakers, like media about your work to respond to that.
Yeah, so I mean, first, as a caveat, I'm brand new to St. Louis and to US work. And it is in part a function of just not being able to get money for the global work. It's not the forms of malnutrition that I'm used to working on. And I do agree with you entirely about, I mean, this is true globally, dysfunctional nature of nutrition. We talked about that yesterday. For a long time, we have had this warped sense of let's focus on a single nutrient and save the world, and vitamin A or vitamin C, and it doesn't work that way. We eat in a diet and we eat with a dietary pattern, and all of those nutrients interact. So we have to keep communicating that it isn't a single food. Eggs aren't going to save the world, and a single nutrient won't also. But in terms of information, that is a difficult question. The Bloom app that I mentioned, that eLab, the med school, is designing, I think their intent is that this, because it's coming from the healthcare system, there's more trust around it, and it's paired with counseling, which will kind of reinforce some of those messages. But yeah, important question.
On the way out. After that, I don't want to grab that.
Yeah, you're welcome.